And no one really wants to be lectured, but everyone wants to be inspired. So, TED unintentionally end up being inspiring to people in all sorts of domains of expertise and professionalist fields that people may or may not know about, but were interesting nonetheless.
Hello, I'm Olivia D'Souza. I'm a multi-passionate entrepreneur. I'm a content and podcast expert. I support visionary entrepreneurs and leaders passionate about living with purpose. Join me as we explore podcasting, life, business, and authenticity. Subscribe for meaningful conversations with a business buddy who gets what it's like. Welcome to Magnetic Pod. Welcome back to Magnetic Pod, where we dive into the stories that propel entrepreneurs forward. Today, we are peeling back the curtain of the art of communication with someone who has truly mastered the craft. I am really thrilled to introduce Jon Yeo, maestro of messaging and the curator of TEDxMelbourne, and a man who believes in the transformative power of connection through communication. I had the real pleasure of meeting Jon in an online workshop that he ran for Tina and Mark Harris for the Courage on Camera membership. And that's why I've invited him here today. He blew us all away with his ability to create a captivating speech in moments just after asking us a few key questions. I remember you saying something about podcasting and speaking as though you were me about podcasting. I'm like, oh my God, that's gold. So as entrepreneurs, we're often told about the importance of clear and compelling communication, and Jon takes it further. He teaches that creating a spellbinding speech is an art and a science that can be learned and repeated. And this is something that he's been doing for over a decade, and he teaches others how to do it too. And so it is an absolute honour to have you here. Welcome.
Hello, good to see you.
Now, you weren't always a coach, were you? If I remember correctly.
No.
Did you was it science or something, if I remember back?
I was an IT nerd. So if you go back far enough, I was in charge of Y2K projects, as everyone chuckles to themselves. But for a good 5 years, I reckon I did maybe 80 to 100-hour weeks trying to get all the stuff over the line so nothing would happen. And so my biggest challenge back then was firstly convincing people that Y2K was a thing. And I ended up in London working on machines where for every 15 minutes a trader's machine was down, they were personally losing £1 million sterling. So I got really good at communication and negotiation, shall we say.
Should we explain to anyone who's too young to know what we're talking about? What's the Y2K bug? I have no idea. Yes. I will remember, of course, but yes.
That's fair enough. I can quickly explain it. It's basically, back then, computers and memory in particular were very, very expensive. In order to save memory, rather than writing 19 whatever for 1989 or 99 or whatever, they would just truncate the 19 bit and just put 88, 89, 90. The challenge is when you do year calculations in the year 2000 and above, it would screw up those calculations. So all computers that were sort of pre that period weren't really equipped to deal with the 2-character years as opposed to the 4 that we use today.
It was a big deal. I remember the lead up to the year 2000, and I couldn't understand if computers could do all this computing. Why is this so hard? But I'm glad you understood it and got us through. Yeah. So how did you go from that to doing what you're doing now with training people on how to speak?
So the speaking communication originally began out of necessity, I guess. And then as the geek in me took over TEDxMelbourne in 2009, I got to access the TED Talks, and I could see when someone would pause, rewind, or abandon a video. And I thought, there's some data I could use to build probabilistic models for someone abandoning your talk. And so I used the data from those talks to, I guess, reinforce the learnings that I had, and was able to share that with the professional speakers and people who really where the speaking and the moment of speaking counted. And it just kind of went from there.
So hang on, your role with TEDx in the beginning was not to do with actually speaking. What was your role where you were looking at?
I'm the licensee, but there was only 2 of us back then. So we were the marketers, we were the operations people, we event producers, we did the coaching, we did everything. And so, the aspect relating to speaking and speaker training eventually fell on my lap.
And so you reverse engineered by looking at the stats of, because I'm doing YouTube now, it's an animated music video, so not really the same thing, but it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating to me, the fact that you've taken that and looked at the spikes and things like that and the drop-offs and gone and actually reverse engineered what the common themes were. That's just amazing. So you just got this. Were you invited to TEDx, or how did that happen?
So a friend of a friend was the original organizer, and she ran, I think, at least one TEDx Melbourne, but had to decide whether she was going to run the next TEDx Melbourne or her wedding. And so she very kindly sort of handed that over, and I guess it landed in my lap, not being an event organizer, but that community was future-focused, optimistic, and just a crowd that were really passionate about ideas. And it was my crowd, and I didn't want the community to die, so I picked it up and ran with it from there.
Wow. There is something special about TEDx. There's something, I don't know, a bit glamorous or a bit sexy or a bit, I don't know. Yeah. I think everyone gets a little bit excited, don't you think, about TEDx? And like you say, like, it's speeches, and speeches could potentially be dull. They could potentially be someone just talking at you about what they're interested in life, and if you're not, then tune out. What do you think it is? What's the magic?
Well, I mean, the brand is ideas worth spreading, and I think that key differentiator is there's a difference between an idea worth spreading and a lesson worth learning. And no one really wants to be lectured, but everyone wants to be inspired. So, TED unintentionally end up being inspiring to people in all sorts of domains of expertise and professionalism, fields that people may or may not know about, but were interesting nonetheless. And so there was this real focus on, how do we change the world? How do we have impact? How do we help people realize the significance of our work, not just understand the logic of our thinking? And kind of went from there.
How did that translate for you? Because you sound like, okay, you've called yourself a geek, or a nerd, no geek. And so you were behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Did you step on the stage at some point, and what did that look like?
What actually happened was, people were asking for advice. I was giving the advice. They were ending up quite successful. And people were asking them, well, what did you do that was different from everyone else? And so it originally began sort of word of mouth referrals, like, oh, this is what John told me, or this is the statistical chance of this happening when I do that. And it's like, people were interested in that. And someone from what's called, well, at the time it was called National Speakers Australia, discovered this little conversation, and they asked me to speak in front of their, they called the certified speaking professionals. I didn't know what the time that was, but effectively it was the top 30 speakers in the region. And so I didn't know. They asked me to talk about how TED was impacting the future of speaking, not knowing that these people had flown in from all countries to hear what I had to say.
Blissfully unaware.
Yeah. I'm a nerd. Selling was the furthest thing from my mind, and the fact that I had only tested it within the TED community. So I took that data and I tested it in front of different industries and different sectors, and found that the principles still worked. And so that gave me the confidence to move forward and start earnestly sharing it with broader circles of people. And now it's pretty much what I do full time.
I'd imagine it'd be like you've looked at the data and you've been able to work out what works and what doesn't, and share it with people and train them. At what point, and how did it look like for you to try it? Was that, I'd imagine it'd be scary, like to notice it all and be teaching it to people, and then at some point going, I'm going to walk the walk and do this.
Yeah.
Was it scary, or was it not? Were you did you have a different perspective on it, where you just went, this is exciting, I'm going with it? Or what was that like?
Well, that's a good question. I don't recall thinking about it look, I remember the first time I ended up going from, I'm going to be the person helping people, to the person being on stage, being quite nerve-wracking. And I don't think anyone doesn't have that transitionary experience. But what the data told me and gave me confidence was that I could shorten the time I was nervous. I could predictably plan when I was having an impact, and I could quantifiably measure when people were paying attention. And so I focused on the things I could control rather than the things I couldn't. And I think that kind of, by definition, took the focus off me and took me into the service of others in terms of helping them learn or grow or listen. And it kind of took away the focus from my anxiety and my, I guess, self-evaluation. The whole imposter syndrome is a thing and nervousness is a thing. But if you give yourself strategies, it gives you clarity and confidence. And I think that was the tipping point for me.
That's incredible, really. That's incredible to just sort of know your stuff so well that you can predict when people will be engaged and that sort of thing. So how do you're predicting that based on being able to look at a video and seeing where the stats will be?
Well, I started with video because I could make a direct correlation and I could rewind and I could reanalyze and I could project forward. So it gave me a lot of, very specific testing points. But where it really flew, and it was actually because you've got to remember back then that the TED events were the speeches, right? So we had to base it on the experience people were having in the room as opposed to data on a video, which I wouldn't get into much later. So how do you do that real-time analytics? How do you be both present and mindful and still know you're going to make an impact? And so I just did a lot of watching, observing, a lot of feedback, and you can viscerally feel it in the room when it happens, when you do it well. And I think everyone's had that moment where you've done something and it just comes out right. But we've found a way to have it come out right, quote unquote, more than 50%, more than random. And playing statistical odds, you can do that, but there's an X% that working or not working. And that's a calculated risk. And then you can plan for your presentations and you can plan for your impact rather than hope that you make an impression.
Okay. So can we get into some of the strategy that you use? How does someone plan? How much practice does it take to know that you've got it and know that you're ready to stand on the stage?
The number of data points I have now is quite significant and would probably, if I just told you all, first of all, we wouldn't have time, but it probably would stress someone out. But starting with some of the fundamentals and some of the basics is, a lot of speakers are not able to summarize their presentation in a single compelling sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge there is that it's not clear in their mind. And if it's not clear in their mind, how can they expect it to be clear in their audience's mind? So when I say single compelling sentence, it's single because of the clarity, as I mentioned, but compelling in that it creates meaning for the listener. What do we need to do to create meaning for the listener, not just understand what you say? And so there's two aspects to that. There's helping people understand what you mean rather than what you say, and then the craft of the ability to say the right thing at the right time to the right person in the right way. And so that second part, the right thing, the right time, the right person, the right way, is really about being thoughtful about your planning. When do you say something that's interesting? How do you make sure it's not overcomplicated, etc.? Now, the complicated part, and this is where I reckon 90, maybe even 95% of people fall over, most messages are too complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to help people to understand two things. Firstly, first principles, and the second thing is what are called second-order consequences. First principles are the aspects of your idea that are so absolutely central that if you forgot even one of them, your idea wouldn't work. Mm-hmm. And so the analogy I like to give there is if you think about a car, some people think Ferrari, some people think Toyota, some people think, anything in between. But another way to think about a car is brake, accelerator, steering wheel, four wheels, and a drive. Now, that might be electric, there might be petrol. But you take away any one of those things, the car no longer works. So helping people understand that there are certain things that you can say that are compulsory and there are certain things that are optional. And the things that need to get across are the compulsory elements, not the optional elements. A lot of people focus on the optional. I've got to say this or got to add this or include this story or whatever. And yes, they're important, but not without the principles. And then even with the principles, they're not the thing that cause someone to get excited. For instance, if I say, eat well, do lots of exercise.
That's not inspiring.
No one does it, right? That's a principle of life. Mm-hmm. And so, if we had to continue in the car analogy, if we needed to think about, well, how do we get people to engage with what we just said? How do we make it compelling? If we think about self-driving cars, on our doorstep, almost here, can't wait to have one. What does that mean? Well, what does that mean for the local council? City of Yarra, just in Melbourne here, over half its revenue comes from parking fines. What happens when cars no longer park? What happens to their tax source, for example? What happens to someone who doesn't need to live in the city of Yarra because it's close to Melbourne? It's about a few K, 3 to 5K, depending where you live. What happens if you don't need to have the high price of inner city Melbourne? You could live in the country and have the car drive in. You could snooze along the way. So your quality of life goes up. The cost of living goes down. The cost of housing goes down. What does it mean for traffic density and public transport? And if you think about very expensive real estate, let's say New York or even Melbourne, about 30% of all footprint in a city is car parking space. What does it mean for land prices and land taxes for those cities when everyone decides they're going to live out bush? And then what happens for the regional towns in terms of public hospitals and public schools when suddenly everyone decides they don't want to live in a city anymore? So these repercussions are massive from a single idea, which is self-driving car. How do we help people understand the scope and scale and significance of what you're saying over and above logically understanding what you're saying? And it's the ability to help people understand that brings them on a journey with you and helps them to relate or resonate with what you just said. And our job as communicators is to resonate, is to influence. If we think our job is information transfer, put it in an email, put it on a website. There's 1,000 other ways to transfer information. But to engage, to influence, to inspire, arguably, the single best way to do it is speaking.
It really does connect. And it sounds like, yes, it really is an art and a science, like you say. It sounds like it's a lot about editing, taking a lot of stuff out.
Yes.
Knowing what to take out and what to leave in, and also how to create that emotional aspect in a journey and a story.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And this is why stories are so helpful. They do create meaning. I think they're a little bit overused, but stories are really helpful for that reason. There's a lot of bioscience why stories are helpful. The short version is our hippocampus and our emotional center, same thing basically, and our long-term memory are all in the same place. So when you stimulate someone's emotions, you're actually stimulating their long-term memory. Whereas if you're stimulating their short-term memory, which is in the neocortex, the front of the head, just below the forehead or behind the forehead, probably a better word, it only stays there for 24 hours. And so then it disappears. And so, if we're appealing to someone's logic and sense, it'll stay there. It'll make sense. It'll connect. But it won't mean something beyond the 24-hour period unless you're able to continually make that connection, which is why marketers say you need to connect with someone at least 7 times before you get an engagement or a sale, because they're trying to connect the long-term and short-term. But why don't you just go straight to the long-term? Why not just connect, engage, resonate, create meaning for people from the get-go?
So you're saying you can save a lot of time if you understand how to communicate well.
You can either save time or you can increase impact. I would always garner or go for bigger impact. Because, humans, time is relative, and people get distracted. But if you have a long-term relationship, if you're able to create meaningful connections with someone, even if you haven't seen them for 10, 20 years, they'll still connect back with you. That's what happens when you connect with your best mates. And so, I don't think we should be rushing things. I don't think speed is a value set that we should be going for. I know people do, but I think the human connection and the desire for human connection, especially in the age of AI and technology, is becoming more important, not less important.
True, yes, because I think people are more aware, and the more that we use AI, the more aware that people may be. Did AI write this? Did AI write this speech? Did AI write this email? Did AI write this web copy? So, how do we cut through and create that connection and overcome that, I guess, resistance people might be beginning to form?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right.
I guess that's how. And so who are the types of people that tend to get trained with you and want to speak and find it beneficial for them?
Yeah. Look, my favourite are change maker brands and driven individuals, people with a little fire in their belly, really believe in what they do. They're my most favourite to work with, simply because they've got so much energy, enthusiasm and clarity. The other groups that are very common are people who've got last-minute speeches. They're a bit harder to work with because, like anything, usually working with something that's already been developed. The other group is really any leader who needs to connect, engage and resonate with a team. So that might be around young people. It might be return to work. the more common recent ones, but also how to build trust, rapport, and relationship with clients and team members over the long term. How do we make sure we're creating these meaningful connections at work as opposed to functional roles at work?
It's a key skill, really. And it's interesting, as someone who's come from an analytical background, that your values are around, the warm, fuzzy stuff, shall we say, that it's really about connection.
Well, it's more than warm, fuzzy. It's human.
Yeah.
It's humans having conversations with other humans. I don't think people want to live in a bubble with only technology and only AI. There'd be almost infinitesimally small group that might want to do that. Everyone else needs that human connection. And it's not just for social reasons. Our biology literally is dependent on us having human connections. People who don't have a lot of friends don't live as long and have higher health challenges and more of them. It's, there's a biological survival mechanism around human connection and engagement. And so our ability to nurture those relationships is not just a business outcome, it's a human survival outcome.
So could you give us any examples of what it's been like to train someone, to take them on a journey of wanting to learn this skill?
Yeah, look, my favorite was a gentleman who was a CEO of a well-known food franchise. Every food court in the country has probably got one of these in the food court. And I was referred to him because someone saw him speak. He was behind a lectern, reading off an A4 sheet of paper. And as the sweat started to accumulate under his armpits, and as the nerves started to take over, you could hear the paper shaking in the microphone. This speaker, or this leader, got so nervous that he actually couldn't finish the speech.
Oh, my goodness.
And so he was referred to me, and I said, what are your goals for speaking? He goes, I want to share the stage with Tony Robbins. I went, okay.
That's awesome to be at that point and still be aiming that high.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. Look, the mind of this man is quite extraordinary, and we struck a really good friendship. We set a goal. Tony Robbins happened to be coming to Melbourne in 3 months' time, so that was our window. It's not a lot of time, but I worked with him, and he eventually pitched his idea. He got his gig and got his opportunity. Tony Robbins liked his presentation so much that he asked him to come back on his subsequent tours and followed him around the country for that particular tour, giving this talk. So he put the work in, but he got the results. And, that's why driven individuals can make a big difference from that point of view, and why clarity makes a big difference as well.
I love that he was, obviously he's probably quite exceptional to be at the top of, I don't know what the brand was. Obviously, it's one of the big ones, and he's at the top there for a reason. But to be at that point where he couldn't finish a speech, but he goes, you know what? I'm going to, within 3 months, share a stage with Tony Robbins, and with your help, it happened. That's really impressive.
It was pretty rewarding, I must admit.
That's awesome. Okay, well, we're nearly at time. So is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like to share? Or how can people work with you?
Well, I'll answer that first question first. The easiest way is to reach out on LinkedIn. And if you're going to connect, just put a little comment and say, I heard you on the podcast, because I get a lot of random people who just basically connect with no message and then try and sell me something. And I, as a rule, obviously don't accept people without a message. I know that sounds egotistical, but the reality is that I reckon at least 90% of the people I accept end up trying to sell me something from the second I accept, and that's just not fun.
No.
That's not why I'm on LinkedIn. But I think I'm really driven by empowering people to reach their full potential, and in particular how they can transform their existence, their business, their lives through speaking and influence. And so I think everyone's got something that's important to them that they want to connect with, even if it's just a loved one at home. That if they could just make their lives just that much better by connecting, resonating, creating meaning with people, everyone's lives could be so much more enriched. And so anyone who's interested in that, I'm always open to have a conversation with.
Well, that tends to be the kind of clients I work with too, people that have podcasts. It's because they have a message, and and they care about doing something and living life a little bit differently. So I'm sure a lot of people will get a lot of value out of this episode. So thank you so much for joining me today.
That's all right. Thanks for inviting me.
And we'll put all the links to how to reach you in the show notes as well. Thanks,
Right.
Jon.
Thank you.
I'm stepping in the next level me. I'm here to be everything I can be. Like a snake, I'm shedding my skin to be my wild next level me. I'm stepping in the next level me. I'm here to be everything I can be. Give you whiplash when you turn around and see me go again. Next level me. It's time to be. Hello, it's Livy here. Have you ever wondered about what the key elements are that make a podcast truly stand out? Or maybe you're thinking about starting your own special podcast and feel a bit overwhelmed and don't know where to start. Well, I have something for you. Introducing the ultimate podcast checklist. Da, 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 da. It's a step-by-step guide that covers everything from the initial brainstorming to advanced growth strategies. It's the perfect companion for both new and seasoned podcasters. And the best part, it's absolutely free. Da, 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 da. To grab your copy, simply head to the show notes of this episode and you will find a direct link there, and then away you go. Remember, every podcast started with that initial spark and the right resource, so let the ultimate podcasting checklist be yours.